The wind in the San Gabriel Valley did not blow. It scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of badlands, stripping the paint off ranch houses and the hope out of men's eyes. It was late October in the year 1878, and the grass was already dead, bleached to the color of old bone. The drought had held the territory by the throat for 2 years, turning the creek beds into cracked mosaics of dried mud and leaving the cattle rib-thin and listless. Jonah Mercer sat on his roan gelding, watching the western ridge of his property. He was a man built of sharp angles and silence, 34 years old, but wearing a face that looked 10 years older. He wore a faded canvas coat that had once been tan and a hat that had lost its shape 3 winters ago. He narrowed his eyes against the stinging dust. This land was dying, and he was stubborn enough to die with it. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking under him. Down in the hollow, 3 strays were nosing at a patch of prickly pear. They were his strays, part of a herd that had dwindled from 500 head to barely 200 since the rain stopped. But it was not just the weather that was killing the Mercer spread. Jonah looked toward the north, where the massive holdings of the Bar Sea grazed on the only green land left in the valley, fed by the deep aquifers Silas Crow controlled. Crow had dammed the upper river, a legality that the territorial judge had signed off on after a private dinner at the hotel in Tucson. In this valley, the law was not a shield, it was a hammer, and Silas Crow held the handle. Jonah turned his horse away from the fence line. He rode past the cairn of stones near the dry wash, the place where his brother, Caleb, had died 4 years ago. A riding accident. The sheriff had called it a broken neck. But Caleb had been the best rider in the county. Jonah knew the truth, though he had no proof. Caleb had found cut fences on the northern boundary, cattle being drove off in the night. He had ridden out to stop it and had come back draped over his saddle. That memory was a stone in Jonah's gut that he carried every day. It made him cautious. It made him quiet. And it made him hate the man who owned the town of Ironwood Creek. Ironwood Creek was a collection of false front buildings huddled against the wind, dominated by the Scarlet Star Saloon and the Mercantile, both owned by silent partners who answered to Crow. It was market day, usually a time of noise and commerce, but today the mood was brittle. Men stood in knots on the boardwalks, their hands near their belts, eyes shifting. The drought made neighbors look at each other like rivals. Every cow that drank was water stolen from another man's herd. Elena Morales guided her buckboard wagon down the main street, her back straight, her hands steady on the reins. She was a woman of 30, with dark eyes that had seen too much of life beginning and ending. She was the valley's midwife and healer, the one they called when the fever broke out or a breech birth threatened a mother's life. She wore a simple dress of gray cotton, clean but mended, and a shawl wrapped tight against the chill. She felt the eyes on her. To the poor homesteaders and the Mexican laborers, she was a saint. To the wives of the cattlemen and the merchants, she was a necessity they preferred to ignore until pain humbled them. But to the men like Crow, she was a loose end. Elena pulled the wagon up to the general store and set the brake. She needed flour and coffee. As she stepped down, she saw the sheriff, a heavy man named Barton, leaning against a post, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He watched her with a look that hovered between leering and suspicion. She ignored him, just as she ignored the whispers. Her husband, Mateo, had been dead for 2 years. He had been a tracker, a man who knew the land better than the wolves. He had taken a job guiding a survey team near Crow's River Depot and had never come home. His body was found weeks later, washed up on a sandbar, drowned. They said, but Mateo could swim like an otter. Elena knew he had seen something at that depot. She had found a small ledger in his saddlebag, filled with numbers she could not decipher, and she had hidden it beneath the floorboards of her cabin. That secret was a cold weight in her chest. Jonah Mercer was already in town, loading sacks of grain onto a pack mule. He saw Elena and tipped his hat, a small, sharp nod. She returned it with a brief lowering of her eyes. They were not friends, merely 2 people who occupied the same hard space on the edge of things. Jonah respected her. He had seen her stitch up a cowboy's leg in a blizzard without her hands shaking. That kind of quiet courage mattered to him. The trouble started near the livery stable. A shout went up, raw and angry, followed by the distinctive crack of a pistol. The sound froze the street. Jonah dropped the grain sack and stepped onto the boardwalk. A crowd was already rushing toward the commotion. He followed, his boots heavy on the wood. In the dust of the street, a man lay groaning, clutching his stomach. It was a young ranch hand from the Bar C, a boy named Toby, a habitual drinker. Standing over him, looking bewildered and terrified, was an older Mexican man, a laborer who sometimes drove for Elena when the roads were bad. Barton, the sheriff, pushed through the crowd, his gun drawn. "What is this?" Barton bellowed. A man in a dusty duster coat, one of Crow's foremen, pointed a finger at the laborer. "He stabbed him," the foreman shouted. "Caught him trying to steal a saddlebag from the wagon. Toby tried to stop him, and the old greaseball stuck him." "I did not," the laborer cried, holding up empty hands. "I was only walking past." The foreman kicked the dirt near the injured boy. "And look here." He stooped and picked up a small canvas sack from the ground. He poured the contents into his hand. Several gold coins and a silver flask spilled out. "Found this on him." The foreman lied, his voice loud enough for the back of the crowd to hear. "And look at this." He held up a small, distinctively carved wooden cross. Everyone knew that cross. It belonged to Elena. She had given it to the laborer to fix the clasp just that morning. Elena pushed through the crowd, her face pale. "That is mine," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I gave it to him to repair." The foreman turned on her, a wolfish grin spreading under his mustache. "Is that so? Or maybe you paid him to cause a distraction? We know you have been asking questions about the depot. Widow, maybe you and your peons are done asking and started stealing." The crowd murmured. The mood shifted instantly, turning ugly. The fear of the drought, the anger at the failing land. It all needed a target. And suddenly, here were two, a foreigner and a woman who knew too much. Sheriff Barton looked at the crowd, gauging the temperature. He saw the foreman's nod. "Arrest her too," Barton said. "Accomplice to attempted murder and theft? No!" Elena stepped back, but two men grabbed her arms. The crowd surged. Someone shouted, "Hang the thieves!" It was a terrifying sound, the collective voice of men who had stopped thinking. Jonah watched from the edge of the circle. He saw the foreman's hand drop the coins. He saw the way the injured boy wasn't bleeding as much as a gutted man should, and he saw the look in Elena's eyes. Not fear, but a terrible, resigned realization. He stepped forward. "Let her go," Jonah said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a whip crack. The crowd turned. Jonah Mercer stood in the center of the street, his hands hanging loose by his sides. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a tired man who had reached his limit. Barton sneered. "Stay out of this. Mercer, this does not concern you." Jonah pointed at the injured boy. "That boy is not stabbed. He is holding a pouch of red dye. I can smell the cochineal from here." The foreman's hand went to his gun. "You calling me a liar? I'm calling you sloppy," Jonah said. "And I'm saying you are not taking this woman." The foreman drew. Jonah moved. He did not draw a gun. He swung the heavy grain sack he had been holding in his left hand, swinging it with the momentum of a hammer. It caught the foreman in the side of the head with a sickening thud. The man went down like a felled tree. The crowd gasped. The spell of mob violence faltered for a second, confused by the sudden aggression from the usually quiet rancher. Jonah grabbed Elena's arm. "Move!" He shoved her toward his horses. The sheriff was shouting, fumbling with his holster. A shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Elena's boot. "Get on the horse!" Jonah commanded. Elena scrambled onto the roan gelding. Jonah vaulted up behind her, not bothering with his own stirrups. He kicked the horse hard. The animal, startled and powerful, lunged forward. Knocking aside two men who tried to grab the bridle, they tore out of Ironwood Creek, the hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire erupted, but they were already rounding the bend past the blacksmith, heading for the open range. They rode hard for 2 hours, keeping to the low ground where the dry creek beds offered cover. Jonah did not speak. He focused on the terrain, his chest pressed against Elena's back, his arms around her to hold the reins. He could feel the tension in her, rigid as a board. The sky to the west was bruising purple and black. The storm that had been threatening for days was finally breaking. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind picked up, screaming through the sagebrush, throwing sand into their faces. "We cannot make it to my ranch house," Jonah shouted over the wind. "They will look there first, and this storm is going to be bad." "Where are we going?" Elena asked, her voice snatched away by the gale. "Line cabin," Jonah yelled. 5 miles up the ridge." The rain began as they started the climb. It was not a gentle soak. It was a deluge, cold and violent. The ground turned to slick grease instantly. The horse struggled, its breathing loud and labored. Jonah kept them moving, guiding the animal with a sure hand, navigating the treacherous footing of the slate rock. By the time the dark shape of the cabin appeared out of the gray curtain of rain, they were both soaked to the bone. The cabin was a small structure of rough-hewn logs, built into the side of a cliff face for protection against the north wind. Jonah slid off the horse and reached up for Elena. She fell into his arms, her legs numb from the ride. He held her for a second longer than necessary to steady her, then pulled her toward the door. Inside, the air was stale and cold, but dry. Jonah shoved the door shut against the wind and dropped the latch. The silence inside was sudden and ringing. He moved quickly, striking a lucifer match against the wall and lighting a kerosene lantern that hung from a nail. The yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing a single room with a stone hearth, a narrow bunk, and a table with a crippled leg. Elena stood in the center of the room, shivering violently. Her dress was plastered to her skin, and her hair hung in wet ropes. "There is wood in the box," Jonah said, his voice rough. "Start a fire. I have to put the horse in the lean-to." He went back out into the storm. When he returned 10 minutes later, a small fire was crackling in the hearth. Elena was huddled before it, rubbing her arms. Jonah took off his soaked coat and hung it on a peg. He walked to the fire and stood opposite her. The danger of what he had done was settling on him now. He had assaulted a Crow employee and broken a suspect out of custody. He was a ruined man, and likely a hunted one. "Why?" Elena asked. She did not look at him, staring into the flames. Jonah took a breath. The heat of the fire was beginning to sting his frozen hands. "I saw the dye," he said, "and I saw the way Barton looked at you. They were not going to take you to a jail cell. Elena, you know that." "I know," she said softly. "But you threw your life away for me? You are a cautious man. Jonah Mercer, everyone says so. Maybe I got tired of being cautious," he said. He moved to the corner of the room where a stash of supplies was kept in a tin box. He pulled out a strip of dried beef and a small sack of coffee beans. Elena watched him. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, highlighting the scar on his jaw and the weary set of his shoulders. She had always thought of him as part of the landscape, hard, unmoving, indifferent. She realized now she had been wrong. "You have no reason to help me," she said. "I have a brother who died because no one stood up for him," Jonah said, his back to her as he ground the coffee with a stone in a bowl. "I did not help him then. I was too slow. I was too afraid of what Crow might do." He turned to face her. "I am not that man anymore," he said. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. She saw the grief etched around his eyes, a mirror of her own. "My husband did not drown," she said. The words came out unbidden. "I know," Jonah said. He walked over and handed her a piece of the dried beef. "Eat," he said. "It will be a long night." The storm raged outside, battering the logs. The wind howled like a lost soul, a sound that made the small cabin feel like the only safe place in the world. They ate in silence, sitting on the floor near the hearth. The intimacy of the space was overwhelming. There was nowhere to look but at each other. Jonah watched the firelight play on Elena's face. She was beautiful. Even with the exhaustion and the fear, there was a strength in her jaw, a resilience that he recognized because he had spent a lifetime trying to cultivate it in himself. "You should not have the burden of me," Elena said. "If they find us, they will hang you too." "They will not find us tonight," Jonah said. "The rain will wash out the tracks, and Crow's men are fair-weather fighters. They are in the saloon now, drinking to their own bravery." He poured water from a canteen into a small pot and set it on the fire. "Tell me what happened at the depot," Jonah said. "If I am to be hanged, I want to know what I am dying for." Elena hesitated. She pulled her shawl tighter around herself. Mateo saw them unloading crates at night. She said, "Not cattle, not grain, crates that were too heavy for 2 men to lift." He said they bore the stamp of the army, but they were being moved onto wagons headed south, toward the border. "Guns," Jonah said. It was not a question. "Yes." She said, "Rifles, stolen from the supply trains and sold to the highest bidder in Mexico. Crow is not just a cattleman. He is a runner." Jonah nodded slowly. It made sense. The cattle business was too lean to support the kind of wealth Crow displayed. The bribery, the hired guns, it all cost money that cows couldn't pay for in a drought. "If you have proof, we can take it to the marshal in Tucson." Jonah said, "I have a ledger." She said, "But it is back at my cabin, under the floor. Then we will get it." Jonah said. He looked at her, his eyes steady. Elena felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was not just gratitude. It was the feeling of a burden being shared, a weight being lifted by another pair of hands. She had been alone for 2 years, holding the world at bay with a stiff spine and a silent mouth. To have someone stand beside her, to have someone fight for her, was a shock that made her want to weep. She reached out and touched his hand. His skin was rough, calloused from years of rope and wire. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah looked down at her hand covering his. He did not pull away. The touch sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The air in the cabin seemed to thin, making it hard to breathe. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a desperate need. It was the same need he felt when he woke up in the empty ranch house, the silence ringing in his ears. It was the need to be known, to be seen, to be something other than a survivor. "You are cold," he said. His voice was lower now, husky. "I have been cold for a long time," she answered. The double meaning hung in the air. Jonah slowly turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. It was a small gesture, tentative and terrifying. "We should rest," he said. "The fire will die down soon." There was only one bunk. It was narrow, a frame of pine poles with a straw tick mattress. Jonah looked at it, then at the floor. "I will take the floor," he said. "No," Elena said. "The floor is drafty, and we have only 2 blankets." She stood up, her hand still in his. "We must share the warmth." She said, "It is only practical." Jonah stood. He was close to her now, close enough to smell the rain on her skin and the faint scent of sage she carried. "It is dangerous," he said. And he was not talking about the posse. "I know," she said. They moved to the bunk. It was a tight fit. They lay down fully clothed, back to back at first, the blankets pulled up to their chins. The darkness of the cabin was absolute, save for the dying embers of the fire. Jonah lay awake, listening to the storm. He could feel the heat of her body pressing against his spine. Every breath she took, he felt it was a torture and a comfort all at once. Slowly, in the grip of the cold, they turned, not to embrace, but to huddle. Elena's head rested near his chest. Jonah's arm lay cautiously over her waist. Outside the blanket, he could feel her shivering subside. "Jonah?" she whispered in the dark. "Yes, do you hear that?" He listened. Above the wind, there was a rhythm, a dull thudding. "Thunder," he said. "No," she said. "Hoofbeats." Jonah stiffened. He listened harder. It was faint, distorted by the gale, but it was there. The sound of riders moving in the valley below. "They are searching," Jonah said. He pulled her slightly closer, an instinct of protection. "Sleep." "Elena," he said, "they cannot track us in this mud. The storm is hiding us." She relaxed against him, trusting his word. Jonah stared into the dark. He knew the storm would pass. He knew the morning would bring clear skies and sharp eyes. He knew that by this time tomorrow, they might both be dead. But as he felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing against his ribs, Jonah Mercer realized something else. He realized that for the first time since they lowered his brother into the hard earth, he was not just surviving, he was living, and he would kill any man who tried to take this fragile, dangerous warmth away from him. He closed his eyes, his hand tightening slightly on her hip, and let the storm rage. The rain finally ceased on the third day, leaving the San Gabriel Valley draped in a heavy, suffocating silence. The storm had not cleansed the land so much as drowned it. The dry creek beds were now swollen torrents of brown sludge that tore away the banks, and the flats were treacherous expanses of sucking mud that could snap a horse's leg as easily as a dry twig. Inside the line cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool. The space was barely 10 feet across, a rough box of pine logs chinked with mud and straw, built for survival, not comfort. For Jonah Mercer and Elena Morales, it had become the entire world. Outside, the natural world had turned predatory. The wolves, driven down from the high timber by the storm, prowled the perimeter of the clearing. Their calls were not the lonely songs of the summer months, but the sharp, yipping cries of hunger. Jonah heard them scratching at the base of the logs in the dark, testing the walls of their sanctuary. It was a grim reminder that out here, weakness was a dinner bell. Jonah sat on a crate near the hearth, trying to mend a tear in his bridle with an awl and a strip of rawhide. He moved his left arm stiffly, a grimace flickering across his face every time he had to apply leverage. Elena watched him from the bunk. She had spent the last 2 days scrubbing the cabin, organizing their meager rations, and pacing the 3 steps from the door to the wall. Her hands, usually so busy with the work of healing, felt empty and useless. "Let me see it," she said. Jonah did not look up. "It is fine, just a stiff muscle. You hold your shoulder like it is made of glass," Elena said, standing up. "And you grunt every time you lift the coffee pot. Take off the shirt." "Jonah!" He hesitated, then set the bridle down. There was no point in arguing with her. He had learned that quickly. Beneath the quiet demeanor lay a will of iron. He unbuttoned the flannel shirt and shrugged it off, wincing as the movement pulled at his back. Elena moved behind him. The firelight cast her shadow long against the logs. She touched his skin, her fingers cool and confident. Jonah's back was a map of hard living, scars from barbed wire, the pale burn mark from a branding iron accident in his youth, and the knotted ridges of muscle built by lifting things heavier than any man should. She pressed her thumb into the muscle near his left scapula. Jonah hissed, his breath catching in his teeth. "This is not a muscle strain," she said softly. "This is an old break. It healed badly. A horse kicked me 5 years ago," Jonah admitted. "I wrapped it tight and kept riding. It was calving season. There was no time to lie in bed." Elena's fingers worked the knot, digging deep into the tissue. The pain was sharp, but behind it, there was a release, a loosening of tension he had carried for half a decade. "You treat your body like a tool you do not own," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of anger and sadness. "You endure the pain because you think suffering is the price of living. Is it not?" Jonah asked. "In this valley?" Elena stopped her massage for a moment, her hand resting flat against his warm skin. "It is what they want us to believe," she said. "Men like Silas Crow. They want us to think that if we just work harder, if we just bleed a little more, we will earn our place. But the game is rigged. Jonah, you can endure until you turn to dust, and they will just step over your bones to take the land." Jonah turned on the crate to face her. Her eyes were dark, filled with a history he was only beginning to understand. "Is that what happened to your family?" he asked. Elena pulled her hand back and walked to the fire. She stared into the flames, wrapping her arms around herself. "My father owned 3,000 acres in the lower valley," she said quietly. "The Rancho de la Luna. We had sheep, horses, and the best well water in the territory. We had a deed from the Mexican government, signed and sealed." She picked up a piece of firewood and tossed it into the hearth. Sparks flew up the chimney. "When the territory changed hands, The new laws came. She continued. Suddenly, the deed had to be verified. There were fees, lawyers who spoke a language my father did not understand. Then came the taxes, levied on land they said was improved, even when it was just scrub. She turned to Jonah. Crow's father was the one who lent us the money to pay the taxes. She said. He smiled and shook my father's hand. He called it a neighborly loan, but the interest compounded every month. When the drought came in '65, we could not pay. They did not just take the land. Jonah, they took our history. They burned the house to clear the view. My father died of a heart attack a month later. He died of shame. Jonah listened, the anger simmering in his gut. It was a story he had heard in fragments across the West. The slow, bureaucratic strangulation of the people who had been there first. I am sorry, he said. The words felt inadequate. Small stones thrown into a canyon. Elena looked at him. Do not be sorry. Be angry. That is what I learned. Sorrow is a heavy blanket that suffocates you. Anger is fuel. She moved back to him, her eyes searching his face. But you, Jonah Mercer, she said softly, you use your anger to punish yourself. You stay on this failing ranch, fighting a war you cannot win alone, trying to make up for your brother's death by working yourself into the grave. Jonah looked down at his hands. You see too much, he said. It is my trade, she replied. To look at where it hurts and find the cause, she reached out and buttoned his shirt for him, her knuckles grazing his chest. The touch was electric, a spark that jumped the gap between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind howled outside, rattling the door latch, but inside, the silence was heavy with things unspoken. The next morning, Jonah saddled the roan. The supplies were running low, and he needed to know what was happening in the valley. He could not leave Elena alone for long, but ignorance was a danger they could not afford. I will be back before sundown, he told her, checking the load of his Winchester rifle. Keep the door barred. If you hear horses, go into the root cellar and pull the rug over the trap door. Do not come out for anyone but me. Be careful, Elena said. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of his old coats. It swallowed her small frame, making her look fragile. Jonah mounted up. He looked at her one last time, memorizing the line of her jaw, the way her hair fell across her forehead. He nodded once, then turned the horse toward the ridge. He rode wide, keeping to the timberline. Avoiding the main trails, the land was a wreck. Carcasses of drowned cattle were tangled in the mesquite bushes near the wash. The mud sucked at the horses' hooves, making the travel slow and exhausting. He met his foreman, a grizzled man named Dutch, at the old windmill on the north section of the Mercer land. It was a prearranged signal. A white cloth tied to the vane meant Dutch was there. Dutch was waiting in the shadow of the water tank, smoking a pipe. He looked tired. I thought you might be dead, Dutch said by way of greeting. Not yet, Jonah said. What is the word? Bad, Dutch said. He spat into the mud. Crow has the whole town spun up. He has got a posse riding, about 20 men. Half of them are his hired guns, but the other half are regular folks, shopkeepers, small ranchers. He has them scared. Jonah, he is telling them that the Mexican widow is part of a bandit ring that is coming to burn the town. Lies. Jonah said. Does not matter if it is a lie if folks believe it. Dutch said. They are searching every barn and outbuilding from here to the river. They hit the Thompson place yesterday. Turned the house upside down. Did they come to my place? Dutch nodded. Sheriff Barton was there. He poked around, asked where you were. I told him you were up in the high pasture looking for strays after the storm. He did not look like he believed me, but he did not have a warrant to tear the house apart yet. Jonah tightened his grip on the reins. They are pushing hard. They are offering a reward. Jonah, Dutch said quietly, $500 for her. $200 for anyone harboring her. That is a lot of money in a drought. Jonah looked at his foreman. Dutch had been with the Mercers for 10 years. He was loyal, but every man had a breaking point. And you? Jonah asked. Dutch looked offended. He took the pipe out of his mouth. I eat your bread. Jonah, I do not sell my friends, But I am telling you, the boys in the bunkhouse are nervous. If Crow squeezes harder, I cannot promise everyone will hold their tongue." Jonah nodded. "I understand. Keep them busy. Tell them I'm tracking a mountain lion that has been taking calves." Dutch looked at him sharply. "Is she worth it?" "Jonah, losing the ranch, losing your life." Jonah looked out across the valley, gray and desolate under the winter sky. He thought of the fire in the cabin, the way Elena's hand felt on his shoulder. She is the only thing in this valley that is real. "Dutch," Jonah said. "He turned the horse. I have to go." The ride back was tense. The sun was dipping low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the scrub. Jonah pushed the roan, sensing the closing window of the day. He was 2 miles from the cabin, crossing a narrow ravine, when he heard the jingle of bit chains. He pulled the roan up sharply, guiding it into a thicket of scrub oak. He dismounted and clamped his hand over the horse's muzzle. Below him, on the trail he had just avoided, 4 riders passed. They wore yellow slickers, and their horses were branded with the bar C. They were riding slow, their eyes scanning the ground. "Look at the tracks here," one man said. "Pulling up. Fresh. The mud is churned up." Another voice answered. "Could be a stray. Or a Mustang." The leader, a man Jonah recognized as one of Crow's top enforcers, a scar-faced man named Pike, spat tobacco juice onto the trail. "Mustangs do not wear shoes," he growled. "Someone rode through here, headed up toward the rim." Jonah's heart hammered against his ribs. He was trapped. If they followed his tracks, they would lead straight to the cabin. He had to draw them off. He looked around. The ground beneath the scrub oak was rocky. If he moved carefully, he could leave no prints, but he needed a distraction. He picked up a heavy stone. He waited until the riders had moved slightly past his position. Then, with a heave, he threw the stone as far as he could down the opposite slope of the ravine. It crashed through the dry brush, sounding like a large animal bolting. "There!" Pike shouted. "He is making a run for the creek!" The riders spurred their horses, tearing down the slope away from Jonah, chasing the sound. Jonah waited until the sound of their hooves faded into the distance. He let out a breath that felt like it had been held for an hour. He mounted the roan and rode, not toward the cabin, but in a wide, looping circle, riding through the stream bed to wash his tracks, doubling back only when he was certain the land was empty. It was fully dark when he reached the cabin. He stripped the saddle off the horse in the lean-to and shoved the door open. Elena was standing by the hearth, holding a heavy iron poker. She lowered it when she saw him, her face draining of color. "You were gone so long," she whispered. Jonah barred the door. He slumped against the wood, the exhaustion crashing down on him. The adrenaline of the encounter was fading, leaving his limbs shaking and his mind raw. They were close. He said, "Crow's men, they found my tracks near the ravine." Elena dropped the poker. It clanged loudly on the stone hearth. She took a step toward him. "Did they see you?" "No, but they are hunting." "Elena, they are not just looking. They are hunting. Like we are wolves." He walked over to the fire, shivering. The cold had seeped into his bones during the ride. He held his hands out to the flames, but he could not stop the trembling. It wasn't just the cold, it was the rage, the fear, the sheer weight of holding up the sky for another day. Elena watched him. She saw the tremor in his hands. She saw the way his eyes stared at the fire, unseeing. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had been running on the edge of a cliff for too long. She moved to him. She did not ask permission this time. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her face against his back. "Jonah," she breathed. He stiffened for a second, then slumped, his head dropping forward. He covered her hands with his own. "I am tired." "Elena," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I am so tired of fighting them." "I know," she said. "I know." She turned him around. His face was streaked with mud and exhaustion. His eyes were wide, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. The stoic rancher was gone. In his place was a man stripped bare by the elements and the threat of death. Elena reached up and touched his face. Her thumb traced the line of his jaw. She felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked the wind out of her. It was grief for her husband, fear for her life, but overwhelmingly, it was a fierce, burning need for connection. She had been a widow, a pariah, a symbol of tragedy for 2 years. She had been a ghost in her own life. She did not want to be a ghost tonight. Jonah looked at her. He saw the shift in her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a dark, intense heat. "Elena," he whispered. She pulled him closer, her hands gripping the lapels of his coat. "We could be dead tomorrow," she said, her voice fierce. "They could come through that door, and we would be nothing but bodies on the floor." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "I do not want to die cold. Jonah, I do not want to die without remembering what it is to be held." She kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, tasting of salt and smoke. Jonah made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him so hard it bruised. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her, the life of her. The coat slid off his shoulders. Her shawl fell to the floor. They moved toward the bunk, stumbling slightly, their hands frantic. It was a shedding of armor. The heavy wool, the leather, the defenses they had built against the world, it all fell away. Elena sat on the edge of the bunk, pulling him down to her. She framed his face with her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Do it now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Do it now. I cannot take it anymore." She did not mean the act itself, not just that. She meant the waiting, the silence, the distance between two souls. She meant the terrible loneliness that had defined their lives. She was begging him to break the dam, to let the floodwaters come, because drowning in him was better than withering in the drought. Jonah understood. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her mouth. "I am here," he murmured against her skin. "I am here." The storm outside had passed, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm broke. It was a desperate, hushed claiming. There were no flowery words, no practiced seduction. There was only the friction of skin, the tangle of limbs, and the ragged sound of breathing. It was a reclaiming of humanity. In a world that wanted to reduce them to prey, they found a way to be people again. They moved together with a rhythm that was ancient and necessary, a defiance against the death that prowled outside. Every touch was a vow. "I see you. You are real. We are alive." Later, the fire burned down to embers. The room cooled, but the bunk was warm. They lay tangled together under the blankets, limbs heavy with exhaustion and peace. Jonah held her, his arm serving as her pillow. He traced the line of her spine with his hand. He felt a fierce protectiveness that frightened him. Before, he had helped her because it was the right thing to do. Now, he helped her because she was a part of him. Elena rested her hand on his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot in the darkness. She brushed it away before he could notice. "Jonah," she whispered. He hummed in response. "Half asleep." "Thank you," she said, "not for saving my life, for giving it back to me." Jonah kissed the top of her head. He did not speak. He held her tighter, staring into the dark, listening to the wind, knowing that everything had changed. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The morning light was gray and unforgiving. It filtered through the cracks in the shutters, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Jonah woke first. The reality of the day hit him before his eyes were fully open. The weight of Elena against him was a comfort, but it was also a terrified realization. He shifted carefully, not wanting to wake her, but she stirred. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, they were soft with sleep. Then, memory returned, and the guard went back up, though not as high as before. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The air was freezing. Jonah sat up beside her. He ran a hand through his hair. The intimacy of the night before hung between them, heavy and undeniable. It was not a regret, but it was a complication. Affection was a liability when you were being hunted. It made you hesitate. It made you fear loss. But as Jonah looked at her, he knew it was also the only reason to keep fighting. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "They are too close. If they circle back to the ravine, they will find the tracks I missed." Elena nodded. "Where do we go?" Jonah stood up and began to dress. His movements were efficient. The rancher returning to work. "We do not run anymore," he said. "Running is just dying slowly." He pulled on his boots and looked at her. "We need to know why. Elena, we need to know exactly what is in those ledgers. We need proof that a judge cannot ignore." He walked to the hearth and began to build up the fire. "I promise to hide you," Jonah said, striking a match, "but hiding is not enough. I am going to find out what Crow is really doing, and I am going to burn his world down with it." Elena watched him. She saw the set of his jaw, the hard line of his mouth, but she also saw the way he glanced at her, a quick, protective look that softened the steel. She stood up and dressed, her back to him. When she turned, she looked like the woman who had stared down a mob in the street. "I am not staying behind." "Jonah," she said. He started to object, but she cut him off. "I know the people at the depot, the washerwomen, the cooks. They talk to me. They trust me. You are just a rancher. I am the midwife. I can go places you cannot." Jonah looked at her. He wanted to lock her in the cabin and keep her safe, but he knew she was right, and he knew he could not stop her. "We go together," he said. "We go together." She agreed. Jonah walked to her. He did not touch her, not like last night, but the space between them was charged. "I will not let them take you," he said. "I know," she answered. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it once, hard. "Now," she said, "let us make some coffee. We have a war to start." Jonah watched her move to the tin box. The guilt of endangering her warred with the clarity of his purpose. He had spent years mourning a brother he could not save. Now, he had a woman he would not lose. The love he felt was terrifying, a jagged thing with sharp edges. But it was the strongest thing he had left. He picked up his rifle and began to clean the barrel. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale, cold light on the valley below. The mud was drying. The tracks were setting. The time for hiding was over. The weeks that followed were a study in the art of disappearance. The San Gabriel Valley was a wide, open bowl of sage and dust. But for Jonah Mercer and Elena Morales, it became a maze of shadows. They moved only at night, navigating by the silhouette of the ridgelines and the stars that burned cold and hard above the mesas. Jonah had established a rhythm of dangerous necessity. He would leave Elena in the hidden safety of the line cabin or, increasingly, at a new refuge they had secured, and ride out to the fringes of the territory. He was no longer just a rancher trying to keep his cattle alive. He was a man collecting the debts of conscience from a valley that had long ago gone bankrupt on morality. He rode to the settlement of Copper Creek, a mining camp 2 days west, where the law was loose and men talked freely after 3 whiskeys. He traded a good pack mule for a conversation with a former freight driver who had been fired by Silas Crow. The man, a sour-faced veteran with a missing ear, sat in the corner of a canvas tent saloon, nursing a jar of rot gut. "Crow does not move cattle at the new moon," the driver told Jonah, keeping his voice low. "He moves crates. Heavy ones, oak and iron. They come up the river on flatboats and get loaded into wagons marked for the reservation agencies, but they never get to the reservations." "What is in them?" Jonah asked. The driver spat on the dirt floor. "Lead and brass, mostly. And repeating rifles. I saw a crate bust open once when a wheel hit a rut. New Winchesters. Army issue?" Jonah nodded, sliding a silver dollar across the rough plank table. It confirmed what Elena had suspected. Crow was siphoning weapons from military supply lines and selling them south or to private militias. It was treason, plain and simple, dressed up as commerce. While Jonah worked the edges, Elena worked the heart. She insisted on it, despite Jonah's protests. "I am not a china doll to be kept on a shelf." "Jonah," she had told him, her eyes flashing with that stubborn fire he was coming to rely on. "I am a midwife. People open their doors to me because they have to. Pain does not care about politics. She disguised herself, wrapping her hair in a severe scarf and wearing the rough clothes of a washerwoman, and slipped into the workers' camps near the river depot. She moved among the wives of the laborers, the women who scrubbed the floors and cooked the stews for Crow's empire. They welcomed her with hushed voices and nervous glances. They knew she was a wanted woman, but they also remembered how she had saved their children from the croup and set their husbands' broken bones when the company doctor was too drunk to ride. In the back room of a shanty made of flattened tin cans, a woman named Maria gripped Elena's hand. "My husband is afraid," Maria whispered in Spanish. "He says the new shipments are not listed in the main ledger. They keep a second book, the Black Book. They call it. It is kept in the safe at the depot office, but sometimes the foreman takes it to the Joy House to brag." Elena listened, cataloging every detail. She learned that the inventory was often marked as lost to spoilage or drowned cattle. She learned that men who asked questions about the discrepancies tended to have accidents, just like her husband. When they reconvened, usually in the gray light of pre-dawn at a predetermined coordinate in the scrub, the relief of seeing each other was a physical weight. Jonah would slide off his horse, his face gray with fatigue, and Elena would already have the coffee pot nestled in the coals of a small, smokeless fire. They did not embrace immediately. The danger of the open range kept them stiff, their eyes scanning the horizon. But the intimacy was there in the small things. Jonah would take the tin cup from her, his fingers lingering on hers for a second too long. Elena would brush the dust from his collar, her hand resting on the nape of his neck, grounding him. "You look tired," she said one morning, 3 weeks into their exile. "I am fine." Jonah lied, sipping the scalding coffee. "You are a terrible liar, Jonah Mercer," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. They sat on a flat rock, shoulders touching. The valley below was waking up, a deceptive picture of peace. "They are talking about us," Jonah said after a moment. "In town." Elena stiffened. "What are they saying?" "That I have gone feral," he said, his voice flat. "That I am keeping you for unnatural reasons. That I kidnapped you to be a concubine. They are calling you a witch who seduced a good Christian man into madness?" Elena looked down at her hands. The prejudice was not new, but it had sharpened. It was no longer just about her race or her gender. It was about her morality. Crow was using scandal to isolate them, painting Jonah not as a hero fighting corruption, but as a deviant hiding a criminal mistress. "Let them talk," Elena said, though her voice wavered. "Words cannot hang us." "No," Jonah said, his jaw tightening. "But words can cut off our allies. A man might help a fugitive seeking justice. He thinks twice about helping a man living in sin with a witch." He turned to her, his expression fierce. "I do not care for my reputation, Elena, but I will not have them drag your name through the mud to save their own skins. It is already mud." "Jonah," she said softly, "but I am clean where it counts, and so are you." She took the cup from him and drank, sharing the rim. It was a gesture of defiance against the shame the town tried to project onto them. In this wilderness, with death hunting them, their bond was the most honest thing either of them had ever known. They needed a place to rest that was not a cold cabin or a rocky overhang. They needed allies who understood what it meant to be pushed to the edge. They found them in the unlikeliest of places. Elijah Reed lived on a scrubby patch of land near the salt flats, land that no cattleman wanted because the water was brackish. Elijah was a man of 60, with skin the color of deep mahogany and a spine that had never learned to bend. He was a veteran of the colored cavalry regiments, a man who had fought for a country that barely recognized his humanity. He found Jonah and Elena hiding in his barn one evening as a storm threatened. Instead of raising the alarm, he raised a lantern and looked them over with cool, appraising eyes. "I wondered when you two would show up," Elijah said, his voice a deep rumble. "We can leave," Jonah said, stepping in front of Elena. "We just needed shelter from the hail." Elijah snorted. "I did not say you had to leave. I said I wondered when you would show up. I've been watching the smoke signals. You move good, Mercer, but you leave a trail if a man knows how to look." He motioned them toward the house. "Come inside. I have stew, and I have a shotgun by the door for anyone who comes asking questions they should not." Inside Elijah's small, immaculate cabin, they met Mei Lian. She was a slight woman of 40, wearing a pristine white blouse and dark trousers. She ran the laundry in Ironwood Creek, washing the stains out of the shirts of the men who ran the valley. She was saving every penny to buy a plot of land for a peach orchard, a dream the town laughed at. Mei Lian sat at the table, her hands folded. She did not speak much, but when she did, the room went silent. "I found this in the pocket of the foreman's vest," she said, sliding a small, crumpled piece of paper across the table. He was drunk when he dropped off his wash. He did not check his pockets. Jonah picked it up. It was a bill of lading, hastily scrawled. It listed 50 head of cattle, but the weight listed was far too heavy for cows. And the destination was not a stockyard, but a mining outpost in Sonora known for harboring revolutionaries. "It proves nothing by itself," Jonah said, frustration edging his voice. "It is just numbers. It proves patterns," Elijah said, ladling stew into bowls. "Crow thinks he is a king. Kings get sloppy. He thinks no one looks at the laundry woman or the old soldier on the salt flats." He sat down, his chair scraping the wood floor. "You have friends." "Jonah," Elijah said, "we do not have money. We do not have the judge's ear. But we have eyes, and we have been waiting for someone to light a match." Elena looked at Elijah, then at Mei Lian. She felt a lump rise in her throat. For weeks, she and Jonah had felt entirely alone, two people holding back the ocean. To see these faces marked by their own battles offered a sudden, overwhelming sense of solidarity. "Why?" Elena asked. "Why risk this for us?" Mei Lian looked up, her expression serene, but her eyes hard as flint. "Because last year, Crow's son ran over my garden with his horse for sport," she said, "and when I complained, the sheriff told me to be grateful he did not burn my shop." Elijah nodded. "And because this valley is choking to death on fear, ma'am." A man gets tired of holding his breath. The group formed a council of necessity. They met in Elijah's barn or behind Mei Lian's drying racks under the cover of moonless nights. They pieced together the fragments of Crow's empire. It became clear that Crow's power was a house of cards held together by the illusion of invincibility. He relied on the fact that the ranchers didn't talk to the homesteaders. The homesteaders didn't talk to the Mexicans, and no one talked to the Chinese. He kept them separated, suspicious of one another. But Jonah and Elena were the thread stitching them together. "We need a witness," Jonah said one night. "The map of the valley spread out on a hay bale. Paper is good. A man willing to swear on a Bible is better." "I know a man," Mei Lian said quietly. "Thomas. He is a clerk at the depot. He is young. He is in love with a girl in Tucson, but he has no money to marry her. He sees the books. He hates the foreman." "Can you get to him?" Jonah asked. "He comes to the laundry on Tuesdays." She said, "I can speak to him." "Do it," Jonah said. "Tell him we can protect him. Tell him we can get him and his girl out of the territory if he testifies." The meeting with Thomas was set for 2 nights later, in an abandoned shearing shed 3 miles south of town. The atmosphere was heavy with impending rain, the air charged with static. Jonah and Elena arrived first. Jonah checked the perimeter, his Winchester ready. Elena paced the dirt floor, her nerves frayed. "This feels wrong," she said, hugging her arms. "It is too quiet." "He is scared," Jonah said, though he felt the prickle on the back of his neck too. "He will be cautious." They waited for an hour, then 2. The moon rose and began its descent. "He is not coming," Jonah said finally. "Then we go to him." Elena said, "If he got cold feet, we have to convince him." They rode carefully toward the outskirts of town, leaving their horses in a grove of cottonwoods and moving on foot toward the small boarding house where Thomas lived. The town was asleep, the windows dark. But as they approached the stable behind the boarding house, they saw a lantern burning. Jonah signaled for Elena to stay back, but she shook her head and moved with him. They crept to the stable door, which was hanging slightly ajar. Jonah pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle. The air inside smelled of hay and manure, but under that, the copper tang of blood and the void of death. Thomas was there. He was hanging from a rafter, a rope thick around his neck. His feet dangled a foot off the ground. A step stool lay kicked over nearby. "Oh, God!" Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jonah moved quickly, cutting the rope and catching the body, lowering it to the ground. He checked for a pulse, though he knew there would be none. The boy's skin was already cooling. "He did not do this," Jonah said, his voice grim. He pointed to the boy's hands. The knuckles were bruised and bloody, and there was a smear of dirt on his cheek that looked like a boot print. "They beat him," Jonah said. "They beat him until he told them who he was meeting, or until he refused. Then they strung him up to make it look like despair." Elena sank to her knees beside the body. She touched the boy's hair. He was so young, just a boy wanting to marry a girl in Tucson. "They killed him because of us," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, cracking under the strain. "He is dead because we asked him to be brave." Jonah saw the collapse coming. It was the moment the weight became too much. Elena had lost her husband, her home, her reputation. And now this innocent boy. She began to shake. Deep, racking tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. "I cannot do this. Jonah," she sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. "I cannot walk over any more bodies. It is too much blood." "The land wants blood, and it is taking everyone." Jonah dropped his rifle and knelt beside her. He did not offer false platitudes. He did not tell her it would be all right, because it wasn't all right. It was a nightmare. Instead, he grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard and grounding. "Look at me. Elena." She shook her head, sobbing into her hands. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice sharp but not cruel. She looked up, her face wet, her eyes wild with grief. "He is dead," Jonah said, "and that is a tragedy that will haunt us. But if we stop now, he died for nothing. If we break now, Crow wins. And if Crow wins, 10 more boys like Thomas will die next year." He pulled her into him, wrapping his arms around her, rocking her slightly as they knelt in the straw beside the dead boy. "I know it is heavy," he whispered into her hair. "I know it feels like it will crush you, but I am holding it with you. You are not carrying this alone." Elena clung to him, her fingers digging into his coat. She wept for Thomas, for Mateo, for the life she had lost. She wept until the well was dry. And through it all, Jonah held her. He was the anchor in the storm, the steady rock that refused to move. He absorbed her grief without crumbling. Finally, the sobs subsided into ragged breaths. Elena pulled back slightly, wiping her face with her sleeve. Her eyes were red, but the wildness was gone, replaced by a cold, desolate clarity. "They killed him to hide the book," she said. Her voice was a rasp. "Yes," Jonah said. "Thomas would not have destroyed it." She said, "He wanted insurance. He wanted a way out." She stood up, her legs unsteady but holding. "Where would a boy hide the most valuable thing he owned?" she asked. "Not here, not where they could find it." Jonah stood up with her. He thought about what Mei Lian had said. Thomas was in love. Letters. Jonah said, "Did he write to the girl?" "Every week," Elena said. Mei Lian said he mailed them on Fridays. They searched the boy's small room in the loft of the stable. It had been tossed, the mattress slashed, the drawers emptied. Crow's men had been thorough, but they had been looking for a ledger, a big, bound book. Jonah saw a loose floorboard near the window, but it had already been pried up, empty. Elena looked at the boy's boots, sitting neatly by the door. She picked one up. It was light. She picked up the other. It felt different. The heel was slightly loose. She turned it over. The leather of the heel had been pried open and tacked back down. "Jonah," she said. He took the boot and used his knife to pry the heel cap off. Inside, hollowed out of the stacked leather, were folded pages. Not a whole book, but pages torn from a ledger. Jonah unfolded them carefully. They were covered in tight, nervous handwriting. Dates, shipments, names of army quartermasters who had signed off on lost inventory. And at the bottom of one page, a note about a payment made to Silas Crow for services rendered in the suppression of local dissent. It was the smoking gun. It linked the cattle business, the stolen rifles, and the bribery. "We have it," Jonah said. He looked at Elena. The triumph was ash in his mouth because of the body downstairs. But it was there. Elena looked at the papers. "This is the end of him," she said. "Not here," Jonah said. He shoved the papers into his inside pocket. "Sheriff Barton will burn these before he reads them. The judge eats dinner at Crow's table. If we show this to anyone in this valley, we are dead within the hour." Elena nodded. She understood. The valley was a closed loop of corruption. "We have to leave," she said. "We have to go to Prescott," Jonah said. "To the territorial marshal. He is a federal appointee. He hates Crow. It is 200 miles. Elena said, "Through the high desert. In winter. And Crow will be behind us every step of the way," Jonah added. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark outline of the town. "We gather our things. We say goodbye to Elijah and Mei-Lian. And we ride tonight?" "Now," Jonah said. He turned to her. "Are you ready?" Elena looked at the boot in his hand, then at the trap door leading down to the dead boy. She took a deep breath, inhaling the dust and the resolve. "I am ready to watch Silas Crow hang," she said. Jonah nodded. "Then let us go get the rope." They slipped out of the stable, leaving the dead to his rest and the living to their war. As they mounted their horses in the cottonwood grove, the first gray light of dawn was bleeding into the sky. It was not a happy light. It was cold and revealing. Jonah reached out and took Elena's hand one more time. "We do not stop," he said. "Not for cold, not for hunger, not for fear. We do not stop," she echoed. They turned their horses north, away from the valley that had been their home and their prison, and rode toward the mountains. The hunt was on, but for the first time, the prey had teeth. The road to Prescott was not a road at all. It was a scar cut through the high country, a winding torture of basalt and scrub oak that climbed into the thin, freezing air of the Mogollon Rim. Jonah Mercer and Elena Morales rode in a silence dictated by the wind and the constant, gnawing awareness that they were being hunted. They had been riding for 6 days since leaving the valley. The horses were gaunt, their heads low, picking their way through the scree. The temperature dropped with every mile of elevation. At night, the cold was a physical weight, a heavy blanket of frost that settled on their bedrolls and stiffened their joints. They stopped in the settlement of Black Canyon to rest the animals and secure funds. It was a rough collection of shacks and tents serving the silver mines, a place where anonymity could be bought for the price of a drink. Jonah stood in the corral of a livestock agent, a man named Henderson who chewed on a soggy cigar stub. Jonah was selling the 3 pack mules and his prize saddle, a hand-tooled piece of leatherwork that had been his father's. He was also signing over the deed to the water rights of his lower pasture, a desperate liquidation of the only assets he could access from a distance. That is a steep price. Henderson grunted, looking at the papers. "You are selling the heart out of your ranch. Mercer, without those water rights, the land is just dust." "I am buying a future," Jonah said, his voice hard. "Do you have the cash?" Henderson counted out $400 in gold eagles and worn bills. It was a fraction of what the rights were worth. But Jonah took it without blinking. He needed lawyers, and lawyers in the territorial capital did not work for cattle on the hoof. They worked for gold. Jonah walked back to the boarding house where he had left Elena. He found her in the common room, sitting near the stove. The room was crowded with miners and drifters. Elena sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, staring into the fire. Jonah saw the tension in her shoulders before he saw the cause. A clerk, a pale man with ink-stained fingers, was standing over her. "We do not serve your kind in the parlor," the clerk said, his voice loud enough to silence the nearby tables. "Kitchen scraps are around back." Elena did not look up. "I'm a paying guest," she said, her voice steady. "I paid for a room and a meal." The clerk sneered. I do not care what you paid. I care about the decency of this establishment. We do not want greasers sitting where decent folk eat." Jonah crossed the room in 3 long strides. The rage that had been simmering in his gut since the valley flared white-hot. He grabbed the clerk by the back of his collar and slammed him face first into the wall. The room went deadly silent. "Touch her again," Jonah whispered, leaning close to the man's ear, "and I will break every finger on your hands." He let the man go. The clerk scrambled back, terrified, clutching his nose. Jonah turned to Elena. "Get your things. We are leaving." Elena stood up. She did not look at the clerk or the miners who were staring with open hostility. She looked at Jonah. There was no gratitude in her eyes, only a weary resignation. Outside, in the biting cold of the street, she stopped him. "You cannot fight every bigot in the territory." "Jonah," she said, "you will exhaust yourself before we even reach the court. I will not watch them treat you like a dog," Jonah said, checking the cinch on his saddle with violent jerks. "It does not matter what they think I am," Elena said, placing a hand on his arm to stop him. "It matters what we do. Dignity is not something they give you. Jonah, it is something you keep." Jonah looked at her. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes were dry and clear. She was stronger than him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He was a man of action, used to fixing broken fences and shooting wolves. She was a woman who had survived a lifetime of small, cutting cruelties without letting them turn her heart to stone. "I sold the rights to the lower pasture," he said, changing the subject because the shame of the world was too heavy to discuss. "We have money for the lawyer." "Then let us ride," she said, "before that clerk finds his courage and a shotgun." 2 days north of Black Canyon, they met Samuel. He was waiting at a fork in the trail near a dry wash, sitting on a mule that looked as old as the mountains. Samuel was a cousin of Elijah Reed, a tracker who knew the high passes better than the Apache. Elijah sent word. Samuel said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice at a lizard. "Said you two were trying to get to Prescott without getting your throats cut. Said you might need an extra gun." "We cannot pay you much," Jonah said. "Elijah said you are paying in trouble for Silas Crow." Samuel grinned, revealing a gap in his teeth. "That is payment enough for me. Crow owes me for a brother he run off the land in 72. With Samuel guiding them, they moved faster. He led them through deer trails and hidden canyons, bypassing the main roads where Crow's bounty hunters would be watching. The bounty had been posted. They saw it tacked to a tree near a watering hole. $500 for Jonah Mercer. Wanted for cattle theft, arson, and treason against the Cattlemen's Association. Treason. Jonah read, tearing the paper down. He calls it treason to tell the truth. "He is scared," Samuel said. "A man does not offer $500 for a thief. He offers it for a witness." The terrain grew more brutal. They were in the high pines now, where the snow lay deep in the shadows. They slept in shifts, huddled together for warmth. The physical bond between Jonah and Elena shifted from the desperate, explosive need of the cabin to a steady, enduring closeness. At night, under the shelter of a rock overhang, Jonah would wrap his coat around both of them. He would hold her hands, blowing on them to keep the frostbite away. "When this is over," Jonah said one night, "the wind howling through the canyon, where will you go?" "I do not know," Elena admitted. "The valley was my home, but I do not think it can be again." "It can be," Jonah said fiercely. "When we win, it can be." Elena looked at him in the darkness. "You still believe the law is a magic spell?" she said softly. "That if we just say the right words to the right judge, the world will fix itself?" "I have to believe it," Jonah said, "or else I am just a man running away." The ambush happened in a narrow cut known as Devil's Throat. The walls of the canyon rose 300 feet on either side, blocking out the sun. It was a perfect choke point, and Samuel had warned them to be quiet. They were halfway through when the first shot rang out. It echoed off the stone walls, a deafening crack that sounded like the mountain itself splitting open. Samuel jerked in his saddle. A red bloom appeared on his chest. He slumped forward, sliding off the mule without a sound. "Samuel!" Jonah shouted. "Get down!" Jonah yelled at Elena. He slapped the rump of her horse, sending it scrambling toward the cover of a large boulder. Jonah drew his Winchester, but the shooters were high up on the rim, invisible against the sun. Another shot kicked up gravel near Jonah's face. A third slammed into his side, spinning him around. It felt like being kicked by a mule. The impact knocked him out of the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs. "Jonah!" Elena screamed. She was off her horse, running toward him, ignoring the puffs of dust kicking up around her feet as the riflemen tried to find their range. She grabbed him by the collar of his coat and dragged him behind the boulder. Jonah groaned, clutching his left side. Blood was already soaking through his heavy canvas coat. He tried to sit up, to return fire, but the world swam in a sickening gray haze. "Stay down," Elena commanded. She grabbed his rifle and leaned around the edge of the rock. She fired 3 shots in rapid succession toward the rim. She was not a marksman, but the return fire forced the ambushers to duck. "We have to move," Elena said, dropping back beside him. "They will flank us. Samuel." Jonah gasped. "He is gone. Jonah," she said, her voice hard and flat. "Look at me. Can you ride?" Jonah grit his teeth. Yes, he could not, but he would. They mounted their horses under the cover of the suppression fire Elena had laid down. They left Samuel where he fell, a tragic marker on the road to justice. They rode hard, scrambling up a scree slope that looked impassable, risking the horses' legs to get out of the killing box. They did not stop until nightfall, when the horses were blowing foam and Jonah was swaying in the saddle, barely conscious. They found a shallow cave near the timberline. Elena helped him down. He collapsed onto the bedroll, his face gray and clammy. Elena worked with a terrifying focus. She built a small fire to boil water. She opened her medical bag. The one thing she had refused to leave behind. She cut away his coat and shirt. The bullet had entered just above the hip bone, lodging in the muscle. It had missed the gut, but it was deep. "This will hurt," she said, pouring whiskey over her knife. Jonah nodded weakly. "Do it." She worked the blade into the wound. Jonah bit down on a piece of leather strap, a guttural groan escaping his throat. Elena's hands were steady. She did not flinch at the blood. She was a healer, and in this moment, she was fighting Crow with a scalpel instead of a gun. She found the lead and levered it out. It clinked into the tin cup. She poured the rest of the whiskey into the wound to cauterize it, then packed it with clean gauze. Jonah passed out from the pain. He woke hours later. The fire had burned down to coals. Elena was sitting beside him, her hand on his forehead. "You are burning up," she whispered. Jonah tried to shift, but the pain anchored him. He looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot and dried blood. Samuel's blood. His blood. "We should not have come," Jonah rasped. "Samuel is dead. I am half dead. I am dragging you into a grave." "Elena, hush," she said, smoothing his hair. "No, listen to me," he said, his voice gaining a frantic edge. "This love, this thing between us, it is a weakness. Crow knows it. He is using it to kill everyone around us." He closed his eyes. "You should leave me here." He said, "Take the horse. Ride to Prescott. Deliver the papers. You have a better chance without a cripple slowing you down." Elena went still. She pulled her hand away from his face. "Is that what you think?" she asked. Her voice was low. "Dangerous. I am trying to save you," Jonah said. "I am terrified that my love is going to be the thing that destroys you." Elena stood up. She walked to the mouth of the cave and looked out at the dark, snow-dusted trees. She stood there for a long time, the silence stretching until it was thin and brittle. When she turned back, her eyes were blazing. "Do not you dare," she said. She walked back to him and knelt, grabbing his shirt front with both hands. "Do not you dare call this a weakness. Do not you dare try to be the noble martyr who dies alone to save the woman. I am not a damsel in a storybook. Jonah Mercer. I am the woman who dug a bullet out of your side while your hands were shaking too hard to hold a gun." She shook him slightly, ignoring his wince of pain. "You want to protect me? Then stop trying to decide my fate for me. I chose this. I chose the road, I chose the danger, and I chose you." She leaned in close, her face inches from his. "You are afraid," she said. "Good. Be afraid. But do not let the fear make you quiet. Do not let it make you surrender." She gripped his hand, pressing it against her heart. "You remember what I told you in the cabin?" she asked. "When I said I could not take it anymore?" Jonah nodded. "I meant the waiting," she said. "I meant the silence, and I mean it now. Do not just feel this love. Jonah, do not just feel the guilt. Act on it. Use it." She stared into his eyes, her gaze piercing through the fever and the pain. "Get up, Jonah. Get up and finish this, because if you die here, you are not saving me. You are leaving me alone in a world that wants me dead. And I cannot bear one more day of that quiet surrender." Jonah looked at her. He saw the fierce, unyielding demand in her eyes. She was not asking for safety. She was asking for partnership. She was asking him to stand up and fight, not just for her, but with her. The shame of his weakness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He was in pain. Yes, but he was not done. "Help me up," he said. "You need to rest," she said, her voice softening instantly. "I will rest when Crow is in irons." Jonah said, "Help me sit up." She put her arm behind his shoulders and helped him lift his torso. The pain was blinding, but he breathed through it. "We ride at first light," Jonah said. Elena nodded, a fierce pride in her eyes. At first light, they arrived in Prescott 3 days later. They looked like ghosts, gaunt, bloody, their clothes torn and covered in the dust of the trail. Jonah was tied to his saddle to keep from falling, and Elena led his horse by the reins. The territorial capital was a bustling town of brick buildings and gas lamps, a stark contrast to the wild valley they had left. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare at the ragtag pair. They rode straight to the office of the territorial marshal. It was a sturdy stone building with the American flag snapping in the wind. Jonah untied himself and slid from the saddle. His legs buckled, but Elena was there, catching him, her shoulder under his arm. Together, they walked up the steps. Inside, a clerk looked up, startled by their appearance. "Can I help you?" "I am Jonah Mercer," Jonah rasped. "This is Elena Morales, and we are here to see Marshal Davies." The clerk hesitated. "The marshal is busy." "Tell him," Jonah said, leaning heavily on the counter, "that we have the Black Book of the San Gabriel Valley, and tell him we have come to testify against Silas Crow for murder and treason." The door to the inner office opened. A tall man with a gray mustache and eyes like polished steel stepped out. He looked at Jonah, then at Elena, then at the blood on Jonah's coat. "I am Davies," the marshal said. "Come inside." They spent the next 4 hours in that office. A doctor was summoned to dress Jonah's wound properly. A lawyer was called. Elias Thorne, a young man with ink on his cuffs and a reputation for hating the corruption of the cattle barons. Thorne looked at the pages from the boot heel. He read the entries, his eyebrows climbing higher with every page. "This is dynamite," Thorne said softly. "Absolute dynamite. This links Crow to the stolen army shipments directly, and the payoff to the judge. This will vacate every ruling he has made in the last 5 years. Can you prosecute him?" Elena asked. Thorne looked at her. "With this evidence, I can hang him. But getting him here, that will be the trick. He has a private army." "I know," Jonah said. He was lying on a leather sofa, his face pale but his eyes bright. Marshal Davies stood up. "I will deputize a federal posse. We will bring him in." "No," Jonah said. He struggled to sit up. "If you ride into the valley with a federal posse, he will burn the evidence he has left and scatter. He will turn it into a war, and innocent people will die." "What do you suggest?" Davies asked. "Issue the warrant," Jonah said. "But let us go back. Let us rally the people he has been stepping on. If the town turns on him, if his own neighbors stand up, his power breaks. He cannot fight a whole valley." "It is suicide," Thorne said. "You are injured." "I am not alone," Jonah said, looking at Elena. Davies looked at them for a long time. He saw the exhaustion, but he also saw the iron. "I will give you 3 days," Davies said. I will telegraph the warrant to the local deputy, the one you said was clean, but I am coming behind you with 20 men, if you are not alive when I get there." "We will be alive," Valentina said. News traveled fast on the wire, but fear traveled faster. By the time Jonah and Elena began the ride back south, rested, rearmed, and carrying the weight of federal authority, the valley was already boiling. Crow had heard of their escape. He had heard of the arrival in Prescott. He knew the walls were closing in. As they crested the final ridge looking down into the San Gabriel Valley, the sky was dark with smoke. Fires were burning on the far side of the river. "He knows," Elena said, watching the smoke rise. "He is trying to burn the truth," Jonah said. "He is trying to scare them back into silence one last time." He checked his rifle. The pain in his side was a dull throb now. Manageable. "Are you ready to go home?" Jonah asked. Elena looked at the valley. It was harsh, cruel, and currently on fire, but it was theirs. "Yes," she said. They kicked their horses into a gallop, riding down into the bowl of the valley, not as fugitives, but as the spark that would finally ignite the powder keg. The silence was over. The reckoning had begun. The return to the San Gabriel Valley was not a homecoming. It was an invasion of a hostile state. Jonah Mercer and Elena Morales rode down from the high passes into a landscape that looked as though it had been scoured by a vengeful god. The drought had tightened its grip, turning the range into a patchwork of gray dust and brittle sage. But the desolation was no longer just the work of the sun. Silas Crow had declared war on the land itself, in the week since the warrant had been issued in Prescott. Crow had moved to strangle the valley into submission before the federal law could arrive. He had ordered his men to dynamite the diversion channels on the North Fork, cutting off the water supply to the small holdings downstream. He had fenced off the common grazing routes, posting armed riders at every gate with orders to shoot any livestock or person that crossed the line. Jonah and Elena did not go to the ranch house. They went to the scorched earth of the lower pasture, where a group of 20 men and women were gathered near a dry well. It was a coalition of the desperate. Elijah Reed with his shotgun across his knees, Dutch, Jonah's foreman, looking haggard and grim, Mei Lien, standing with the washerwomen, and a dozen small-time homesteaders who had seen their crops wither in the span of 3 days. When Jonah rode into the circle, the silence was heavy. They looked at him not as a savior, but as the man who had struck the match that started the fire. "We have the warrant," Jonah said. His voice rasped from the dust. "A warrant is a piece of paper," Elijah said, spitting on the cracked ground. "Crow has men with repeaters. He cut the water to the south settlements yesterday. My well is pumping mud." "Jonah, then we dig deeper," Jonah said, dismounting, "and we fight back. We are ranchers, Jonah, not soldiers," a man named Tobias said. He was a sheep farmer, a gentleman whose face was etched with panic. "If we stand up, he will burn us out." "He is already burning you out," Elena said. She slid from her horse, her movement stiff but commanding. She stood beside Jonah, dusty and worn, but holding her head high. "He is starving your cattle and stealing your water," she continued, looking from face to face. "He is counting on you to be quiet so he can take what is left. He thinks you will trade your dignity for a few more days of survival." She walked toward Tobias. "Is that what you want for your children? To live on land that Silas Crow allows you to keep until he decides he wants that too?" Tobias looked down. "No, ma'am." "Then we stand," Jonah said. "We pool our resources. We share the water from my upper spring until the marshal gets here. We ride in groups. And we do not let him take one more inch." The escalation was immediate and brutal. Crow's strategy was simple: break the spirit of the resistance by destroying their livelihood. 2 nights after their return, the moon was hidden behind a thick veil of dust. Jonah was on watch at the perimeter of his ranch. Rifle in hand, the air smelled of ozone and dry earth. The attack did not come with gunfire. It came with fire. A flicker of orange light erupted on the eastern horizon, near the main barn. It grew instantly, climbing the dry timber of the walls. "Fire!" Jonah shouted, firing 3 warning shots into the air to wake the bunkhouse. He spurred his horse toward the blaze. By the time he reached the yard, the barn was a roaring inferno. The heat was physical, a wall of force that singed his eyebrows. Inside, the screaming of the horses was a sound that tore at his soul. "Get the doors!" Dutch yelled, running from the bunkhouse in his long johns, dragging a water trough bucket. Jonah dove off his horse. He ran to the main doors, shielding his face with his arm. The wood was hot enough to blister skin. He threw the latch and heaved the doors open. Smoke billowed out, thick and black. A terrified mare bolted past him, her mane smoking. Jonah rushed inside, into the suffocating heat. He grabbed the halter of the lead stallion, a horse he had raised from a foal. The animal was rearing, eyes rolling in terror. "Easy," Jonah coughed, dragging the animal toward the light. He managed to get 4 horses out before the roof groaned. "Get back!" Dutch screamed. Jonah scrambled backward, dragging Elena with him. She had run from the house with a wet blanket to beat the flames. The roof collapsed with a shower of sparks that lit up the night sky like a perverse celebration. They stood in the yard, panting, soot-stained, watching the winter feed burn. 50 tons of hay, the only thing that would have kept the herd alive through the coming months, turned to ash in an hour. Jonah watched the flames reflect in Elena's eyes. She was not crying. She was watching the fire with a cold, terrifying calculation. "He thinks this makes us weak," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. Jonah wiped the soot from his face. He put his arm around her, feeling the tension in her frame. "He is wrong," Jonah said. "This just makes us free. We have nothing left to lose." The valley became a siege zone. Dust storms swept through daily, turning the noon sky to twilight. Water was rationed by the cup. The coalition moved like a guerrilla army, moving cattle to the few remaining springs under cover of darkness, cutting crows' wire fences to access blocked grazing land. Elena became the heart of the resistance. She did not carry a gun, but she carried something more dangerous: hope. When the wife of a homesteader named Miller went into labor 3 weeks early, trapped on a farm surrounded by crows' riders, it was Elena who saddled a horse. "You cannot go," Jonah said. "They will take you." "She needs me," Elena said, checking her medical bag. "And I am going." Jonah rode with her, along with Elijah and Dutch. They approached the Miller farm at a gallop. 3 of Crow's men blocked the road, rifles raised. "Turn back," one of them shouted. "This road is closed by order of the Cattlemen's Association." Jonah pulled his Winchester. "This is a public road, and we are coming through. We have orders to shoot trespassers." The rider sneered. Elena rode her horse straight at them. She did not slow down. She did not look at the rifles. She looked the lead rider in the eye. "I am going to deliver a baby," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "If you want to shoot a midwife on her way to a birth, you go right ahead. But know that your mother would curse your name for eternity." The rider hesitated. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at the fierce, small woman on the horse. The shame of it, the sheer dishonor of shooting a woman doing God's work, broke his resolve. He lowered the rifle. "Let her pass," he muttered. They rode through. The birth took 12 hours. Outside, the dust howled against the siding. Jonah and the men stood guard on the porch, watching the shadows. Inside, Elena fought for 2 lives. When the cry of the infant finally pierced the air, thin and strong, it felt like a victory greater than any gunfight. Jonah went inside. He saw Elena washing her hands in a basin, her face gray with exhaustion but lit from within. Mrs. Miller held the baby. A boy. "Life insists," Elena whispered to Jonah as they stepped outside into the dawn. "Even here, even now." The breaking point came 2 days later in Ironwood Creek. Sheriff Barton, pressured by Crow to end the insurrection, decided to make his move. He knew he could not arrest 50 ranchers, but he could arrest the symbol of their unity. Jonah and Elena had ridden into town to meet the circuit judge, Judge Pendergast, who had finally arrived to hear the preliminary motions of the federal case. The town was tense. Shopkeepers watched from behind shuttered windows. As they walked toward the courthouse, Sheriff Barton stepped out of the Scarlet Star Saloon. He was flanked by 6 deputies, men with hard eyes and loose holsters. "Hold it right there," Barton said. Jonah stopped. He moved slightly in front of Elena, his hand hovering near his Colt. "We have a court date." "Sheriff," Jonah said. "You have a warrant," Barton corrected. "For the woman. Aiding and abetting a fugitive. Theft. Public disorder. That warrant is invalid." Jonah said, "Marshal Davies annulled it. I do not take orders from a piece of paper in Prescott." Barton spat. "I take orders from the law of this valley. Seize her." The deputies stepped forward. Jonah drew his gun. He did not aim it. He held it at his side, a clear warning. "Do not touch her," Jonah said. "You going to shoot 6 men? Mercer?" Barton laughed. "You are one man." "No," a voice called out. "He is not." Elijah Reed stepped off the boardwalk. He racked the slide of his shotgun. May Leanne stepped out of her laundry shop, holding a heavy iron bar. From the mercantile, Dutch and 3 other ranch hands emerged, rifles in hand. The street began to fill. The homesteaders, the widows, the laborers who had been silent for so long, they stepped out of the shadows. They did not shout. They simply stood. A wall of people between the sheriff and the couple. Barton looked around. The confidence drained from his face. He was looking at a town that had stopped being afraid. "This is an unlawful assembly," Barton shouted, his voice cracking. "This is the jury," Elena said. She stepped out from behind Jonah. She walked toward Barton until she was 3 feet from him. "You want to arrest me, Sheriff?" she asked quietly. "Do it. Put the cuffs on. But know that every person here sees you. They see you for what you are, a dog on Silas Crow's leash." Barton's hand twitched toward his gun. He looked at Jonah's steady gaze. He looked at Elijah's shotgun. He looked at the 100 eyes watching him. He spat on the ground and turned away. "Get back to your posts," he growled to his deputies. "We will settle this in court." The crowd parted to let Jonah and Elena pass. As they walked up the steps of the courthouse, Jonah took Elena's hand. He did not care who saw. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that love was stronger than their law. The courtroom was a stifling box of stale air and tension. Judge Pendergast sat behind the high bench, wiping sweat from his bald head with a handkerchief. He was a man who preferred quiet backroom deals to the glare of public scrutiny, and he looked unhappy to be there. Silas Crow sat at the defendant's table. He was a large man, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, looking bored. He did not look at Jonah. He looked at the judge with an expression of expectant ownership. The gallery was packed. Every seat was taken, and men stood 3 deep along the walls. The proceedings began with the droning of clerks. Elias Thorne, the young lawyer from Prescott, laid out the case. He spoke of fraud, of theft, of murder. He spoke well, but words were cheap in Ironwood Creek. "We call our first witness." Thorne said, "Mr. Jedediah Stoddard." Stoddard was a former ranch hand for the Bar C. He had come to Jonah 3 nights ago, weeping, confessing that he had helped move the crates of rifles. He had sworn he would testify. Stoddard took the stand. He looked terrified. He kept glancing at the back of the room, where Crow's foreman, Pike, was leaning against the doorframe, cleaning his fingernails with a long knife. "Mr. Stoddard," Thorne said, "did you, on the night of November 3rd, witness a shipment of crates at the river depot?" Stoddard swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "No, sir," Stoddard whispered. The courtroom buzzed. Thorne froze. "Mr. Stoddard," Thorne said, his voice tight, "you signed a deposition stating, 'I was drunk,'" Stoddard blurted out, tears welling in his eyes. "I was drunk and I was mad at Mr. Crow for firing me. I made it up. All of it. I never saw no rifles." Crow smiled. It was a reptile smile, cold and satisfied. Thorne looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the witness is clearly under duress. The witness has answered," Judge Pendergast said, banging his gavel. "Do you have any evidence that isn't hearsay or the ramblings of a drunkard counselor? Because if not, I am inclined to dismiss these charges and go get my lunch." The case was collapsing. Jonah felt it. The air was being sucked out of the room. The fear was returning, settling on the crowd like dust. If Crow walked out of here today, he would kill them all, not quickly, but slowly, one by one. Jonah looked at Elena. She was pale, her hands gripping the rail of the bench in front of her. She looked at him, and he saw the plea in her eyes. "Do something." Jonah stood up. "I have evidence," Jonah said, his voice cut through the murmur. "Sit down." "Mr. Mercer," the judge snapped. "You are not counsel. I have the ledgers," Jonah said, walking into the aisle. The room went dead silent. Crow stopped smiling. He turned in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Jonah reached into his coat. He pulled out the packet of pages they had found in the dead boy's boot. "These are pages from the secondary ledger kept at the river depot," Jonah said, holding them up. "They detail dates, shipment weights, and payments from the Mexican militia. And they detail a payment of $5,000 to a certain Judge Pendergast in 1876. The judge went white. "That is inadmissible," Pendergast shouted. "Standing up. Stolen property. It is the truth," Jonah roared. He walked to the front of the room. He slammed the papers onto the clerk's desk. "And I can verify them," Jonah said, turning to face the crowd. "Because I was there, I watched the shipments. This was the lie. He hadn't been there, but he had to place himself at the scene to validate the timeline, to make himself a material witness." Crow's lawyer jumped up. "Objection, Mr. Mercer is a fugitive. He is admitting to trespassing and conspiracy." "I'm admitting to it," Jonah said, looking straight at Crow. "I was there. I helped move the crates. I saw what was in them. I am an accomplice." The crowd gasped. Elena stood up, her hand over her mouth. She knew what he was doing. He was implicating himself. He was confessing to a felony to ensure the evidence was admitted. He was trading his freedom for Crow's destruction. "You are confessing to treason." "Mercer," Pendergast asked, his voice trembling. "If that is what it takes to hang him," Jonah said, pointing a shaking finger at Crow, "then yes, I am guilty. But so is he. And unlike him, I am willing to pay for it." Jonah turned to the gallery. "He killed Caleb," Jonah shouted. "The grief of 4 years finally breaking the surface. He killed my brother to keep this secret. He killed Thomas, a boy of 19, to hide these papers. He is not a baron. He is a butcher." Crow stood up, his face purple with rage. "You shut your mouth, you dirt-farming peasant! He did it!" Stoddard screamed from the witness stand. "He broke." The sight of Jonah sacrificing himself shattered the cowboy's fear. "He did it!" Stoddard yelled, pointing at Crow. "I saw him give the order to hang the boy. I saw it. And I saw the judge take the money envelope at the saloon. Pandemonium erupted." The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Men were shouting, climbing over benches. "Sheriff!" Pendergast screamed, banging his gavel so hard the handle snapped. "Clear the court. Arrest them both." Crow's men in the back tried to push forward, but the crowd turned on them. The ranchers, the homesteaders, the people who had been pushed too far. They formed a wall. Punches were thrown. A chair flew through the air. Marshal Davies, who had arrived quietly in the back of the room during Jonah's speech, stepped forward. He pulled a long-barreled peacemaker from his coat. "Sit down," Davies bellowed, the authority in his voice, backed by the sudden appearance of 4 federal deputies at the doors, froze the room. Davies walked to the bench. He picked up the ledger pages. He looked at Pendergast. "You are relieved of duty." "Judge," Davies said cold, "pending a federal inquiry into corruption." He turned to Crow. "Silas Crow, you are remanded to custody. Federal custody." Crow looked at his men. He looked at the exits. He saw only hostile faces. "You cannot do this," Crow hissed. "I own this valley." "Not anymore," Jonah said. He was standing in the center of the storm, his chest heaving. "Deputies, take him," Davies ordered, as the handcuffs clicked onto Crow's wrists. A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of vindication that shook the rafters. But it was not over. Outside, the sound of glass breaking shattered the moment. A gunshot rang out, close and loud. Crow's private militia. The men who had not been in the courtroom had surrounded the building. "Let him go," a voice shouted from the street, "or we burn it down with all of you inside." Elena ran to Jonah's side. She grabbed his arm. "They are not going to let him leave," she said. Jonah looked at her. He touched her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. "Then we fight our way out," he said. He picked up his rifle from the evidence table where the bailiff had left it. He looked at Elijah, at Dutch, at the men and women of the valley who were now armed with nothing but righteous anger and the few weapons they had smuggled in. "Open the doors," Jonah said to the marshal. Davies looked at him. "You are under arrest too, Mercer. By your own confession." "I know," Jonah said, "but you need my gun right now more than you need my wrists in irons." Davies nodded grimly. He looked at the deputies. "Open them." The double doors of the courthouse swung open. The blinding afternoon sun flooded in. The square was filled with mounted men, rifles leveled at the steps, but behind them, coming from the side streets, were more people. The town was waking up. The shopkeepers were coming out with shotguns. The women were throwing stones. The fear had broken, and in its place was a chaotic, beautiful fury. Jonah stepped out onto the porch, Elena beside him. He racked the lever of his Winchester. "This ends today," Jonah shouted to the valley, and the first shot of the final battle rang out. The chaos outside the courthouse was a blinding storm of dust and gunpowder. The sun was dipping low toward the western ridges, casting long, blood-red shadows across the square of Ironwood Creek. The air was thick with the sharp crack of rifles and the panicked shouting of men who had never expected the sheep to bite back. Crow's militia, a group of 20 hardened mercenaries paid in gold and whiskey, found themselves flanked. They had expected to slaughter a few unruly farmers. Instead, they were facing a town that had found its spine. The shopkeepers fired from the rooftops. The ranch hands fired from the alleyways. It was sloppy, desperate, and fierce. In the confusion, a buckboard wagon smashed through the line of deputies near the livery stable. Driving it was Pike, Crow's foreman, whipping the horses into a frenzy. In the back, crouching low, was Silas Crow. He clutched a heavy leather satchel to his chest, the master ledgers he had kept hidden in the bank vault, the ones that listed every bribe, every stolen acre, and every man he had ordered killed. "He is running!" Jonah shouted, vaulting over the hitching rail. Jonah ignored the pain in his side, the wound from the ambush still a raw fire in his flesh. He ran to his roan, which was rearing against the reins held by a terrified boy. Elena was already mounting a gray mare she had commandeered from the sheriff's line. She looked at Jonah, her eyes dark with the knowledge of what had to be done. "If he destroys those books, he walks free," she said. "He is heading for the Badlands," Jonah said, swinging into the saddle. "He thinks he can lose us in the arroyos." Marshal Davies ran out of the courthouse, his face bleeding from a graze on his cheek. He saw Jonah and Elena turning their horses. "Wait for the posse," Davies yelled. "There is no time." Jonah shouted back. He kicked the roan. The horse lunged forward, scattering the crowd. Elena was right beside him, and behind them came Elijah Reed on his plow horse and Dutch, grim-faced and armed with a repeater. They tore out of town, leaving the gunfight behind them. The chase was on, not for glory, but for the final nail in the coffin of a tyrant. The pursuit led them south, into the harshest country the territory had to offer. This was the Devil's Anvil, a landscape of broken shale, twisting slot canyons, and mesquite thickets so dense they could tear a rider from the saddle. The sun vanished, leaving a bruised purple twilight that made the footing treacherous. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, covering the sound of hoofbeats. Jonah rode by instinct. He knew this land. He knew that Crow was heading for the old miner's track that led to the border. If Crow crossed the river, he was gone, and the truth went with him. They found the wagon 2 miles in, smashed against a boulder where a wheel had shattered. The horses were cut loose. The tracks of 3 mounted men led up a narrow, dry wash. "He is on horseback now," Elijah said, sliding from his saddle to check the ground. Moving slow, the horses are carrying double weight. Pike and Crow on one, his guard on another. We can catch them before the ridge, Jonah said. They pushed the horses to their limit. The animals lathered, their breathing ragged in the cooling air. The moon rose, a sliver of bone in the black sky, illuminating the canyon walls in ghostly relief. They cornered them in a box canyon known as Dead Man's Drop. It was a cul-de-sac of stone, steep walls rising on 3 sides. Crow and his men had dismounted. They had taken cover behind a cluster of fallen rocks. In the center of their small fortification, a small fire was already flickering. "He is burning them," Elena cried out. Seeing the glint of the flames, Crow was tearing pages from the leather satchel and feeding them to the fire. He looked frantic, a man trying to erase his history one sheet at a time. Jonah pulled his rifle. "Spread out." They moved into the cover of the scrub brush. Gunfire erupted immediately from the rocks. Bullets whined off the canyon walls, sending chips of stone flying. "Surrender." "Crow!" Marshal Davies's voice boomed from the canyon entrance. He had caught up, riding hard with 4 deputies. "You are surrounded!" Crow did not answer. He just fed more paper to the fire. Pike stood up to fire, his face twisted in a snarl. Jonah took aim. He breathed out, steadying his shaking hands. He fired. Pike spun around, his shoulders shattered. He fell back, dropping his rifle. "Move in," Davies ordered. The deputies advanced, firing suppression rounds. Jonah and Elena moved up the left flank, using the darkness of the canyon wall. Crow saw the walls closing in. He grabbed the satchel, now smoking, and pulled a revolver from his belt. He grabbed one of his own men, a young hired gun, and shoved him into the line of fire as a human shield. The cruelty of it made Jonah pause. In that second of hesitation, Crow leveled his gun at Elena, who was moving between 2 boulders. "Elena!" Jonah screamed. He lunged from his cover, trying to draw fire, but he was too far away. It was Elijah Reed who moved, the old soldier, who had spent a lifetime being pushed to the back of the line, had flanked deeper than anyone realized. He stepped out from the shadows, directly in Crow's line of sight, his shotgun raised. Crow turned and fired. The bullet struck Elijah in the chest. The impact knocked the old man backward, but he did not fall. Not yet. He held his ground, his boots planted in the dust of the country he had fought to build. He pulled the trigger of both barrels. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space. Crow's revolver flew from his hand, shattered. The satchel was blown from his grip, scattering burning pages across the dirt. Crow screamed, clutching his hand, falling to his knees. Elijah crumbled. Jonah and Elena ran to him. The firefight ended instantly. Crow's remaining men threw down their guns, terrified by the carnage. Jonah skidded to his knees beside Elijah. Elena was already there, her hands pressing desperately against the wound in his chest, but the blood was dark and coming too fast. "Elijah," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her dusty face. "Elijah." "Hold on." The old man looked up at the stars. His breathing was wet and shallow. He looked at Jonah, then at the smoking remnants of the ledgers that had been saved. "Did we get him?" Elijah wheezed. "We got him." "Elijah," Jonah said, his voice choking. "You got him?" Elijah smiled. It was a peaceful expression, stripping away the years of hardness. "Good," he whispered. "I was tired of walking." With my head down, his eyes drifted shut. The chest rose once, hitched, and then settled. Silence claimed the canyon. It was a heavy, reverent silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. Jonah looked at the man who had saved them. Elijah Reed, born into chains, a soldier of the Union, a homesteader on the Salt Flats, had died a free man protecting the future of a valley that had never welcomed him. Elena wept, her forehead resting on Elijah's still chest. Jonah put his hand on her shoulder, his own tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. He looked up and saw Crow being dragged to his feet by the deputies. Crow was weeping too, but it was the weeping of a coward who had lost his power. Jonah stood up. He walked over to Crow. The deputies stepped back. sensing the violence radiating from the rancher. Jonah looked at the man who had killed his brother, who had killed Thomas, who had just killed Elijah. His hand hovered over his colt. It would be so easy. It would be justice of the old kind. Crow looked at him, fear in his eyes. "Do it," he hissed. "Get it over with." Jonah stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he unbuckled his gun belt. He let it drop to the dirt. "No," Jonah said, his voice cold as the grave. "That is too quick for you. You are going to rot in a cell. Crow, you are going to watch this valley bloom while you wither in the dark. You are going to live to see everything you built turn to dust." He turned his back on the tyrant and walked back to Elena and the body of his friend. "Let us take him home," Jonah said. The trial of Silas Crow was not held in Ironwood Creek. It was held in the territorial capital of Prescott, under the scrutiny of federal judges and journalists from as far away as San Francisco. The evidence from the depot, combined with the charred remnants of the master ledger saved by Elijah, was damning. The testimony of Jonah Mercer, who admitted to his own complicity to secure the truth, became the centerpiece of the proceedings. Crow was convicted on 12 counts of murder, conspiracy, and treason. He was sentenced to hang, but a commutation to life imprisonment at the territorial prison in Yuma, a hellhole of heat and rock, was granted in exchange for the names of his conspirators in the government. The Ironwood precedent, as the newspapers called it, rippled outward. It led to the dismissal of 3 corrupt judges and the redrawing of land claim laws throughout the Southwest. It established that private militias had no standing against federal law, and that a witness, no matter their race or station, had the right to protection. But laws are written on paper. Life is written on the land. In the San Gabriel Valley, the change was slower, but it was deep. The drought broke in the spring of 1879. The rains came gentle and long, soaking the scorched earth, turning the gray sage to a brilliant, living green. The rebuilding of the Mercer Ranch became a symbol of the new order. Jonah had no money to hire a crew. He did not need one. They came on a Tuesday morning. Tobias the sheep farmer brought his sons. May Leanne brought food and nails. The widow Miller brought her healthy baby boy and a quilt. Men who had once looked at Jonah with suspicion now looked at him with respect. They raised the new barn in 3 days. It was built of sturdy oak, hauled from the high timber by a team of mules driven by Dutch. When the final beam was placed, they did not just celebrate a building, they celebrated a community that had learned it could survive only if it stood together. Elena was formally cleared of all charges. The town of Ironwood Creek, forced to confront the evidence of the trial, had to reckon with its own conscience. There were no parades in her honor. That was not the way of the West. But there were nods on the street. The clerk at the mercantile stopped overcharging her for flour. The doctor, shamed by her courage, asked for her consultation on difficult cases. It was an uneasy peace at first, but it was a start. The shame of their cowardice was a bitter pill, but they swallowed it. And in doing so, they began to heal. For Jonah and Elena, the victory was quiet. They did not marry immediately. They waited until the ranch was solvent, until the ghosts had settled. They lived in the ranch house, which Elena transformed from a bachelor's dusty fortress into a home. She planted a garden near the porch, sage, lavender, and wild roses. Jonah rebuilt the corral fences, not with barbed wire this time, but with smooth rail, a signal that he was no longer trying to keep the world out. Their love was not the fiery, desperate collision of the line cabin. It had matured into something durable, like the ironwood trees that anchored the riverbanks. It was a tenderness born of shared survival. They ate dinner together every night at a table Jonah had built. It was a large table, far too big for 2 people, and it was rarely empty. Elijah's cousin, Samuel's widow, drifting hands looking for work. They all found a place at the Mercer table. It became a gathering place for the marginalized, the people the valley had once tried to erase. They broke bread, they told stories, and they planned for a future where a man's worth was not measured by the size of his herd. But the trauma was there. It lived in the silence of the night. Jonah would wake up sweating, the smell of smoke in his nose, the sound of Elijah's shotgun ringing in his ears. Eliana would wake with a gasp, dreaming of the mob in the street or the cold terror of the flight to Prescott. In those dark hours, they did not turn away from each other. "I see him," Jonah whispered one night, the moonlight slanting across the bed. "I see Elijah falling. I feel like it should have been me." Elena turned to him. She placed her hand on his chest, over the scar where the bullet had gone in. "It was not you," she said softly. "Elijah chose his death so we could choose our life. Do not dishonor him by regretting it. Live a life worth his price." "Jonah," she kissed the scar, "we carry them with us?" She said, "Caleb, Thomas, Elijah, they are the foundation of this house. They held each other until the dawn came, the light washing away the shadows, reminding them that they had earned the right to see another day." Epilogue. 5 years later, the valley was green, the cattle were fat. The San Gabriel Valley had become a place of small, prosperous holdings rather than one man's kingdom. A town council had been formed, elected by popular vote. Mei Lian sat on the council, the first woman and the first Asian American to hold such a seat in the territory. She argued fiercely for water rights and school funding. And the men listened, because they knew she had faced down a sheriff with an iron bar. On the porch of the Mercer Ranch, Jonah sat in a rocking chair, watching a toddler take his first unsteady steps in the dust. The boy, named Elijah, had dark eyes and a stubborn chin. Elena sat on the steps, mending a shirt. She looked up at Jonah and the boy. The wind blew, but it was a gentle wind now, carrying the scent of rain and blooming cactus. Jonah looked out at the valley. He saw the fences of his neighbors. He saw the schoolhouse in the distance. He saw a world that had been remade, not by magic, but by the stubborn refusal to surrender. He looked at Elena. She was more beautiful now than the day he met her. The lines around her eyes were from smiling, not squinting against the glare of hate. She caught his eye. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I was thinking about the cabin," Jonah said. "I was thinking about what you said." "What did I say?" Jonah smiled. "Do it now." Elena laughed. A rich, warm sound. "You took it literally." "I took it to heart," Jonah said. He stood up and walked down the steps. He picked up the boy, swinging him into the air. The child laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. Jonah looked at his wife. "We did it," he said. "We did not just survive. Elena, we lived." Elena stood and walked to him. She wrapped her arms around her husband and her son. "Yes," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "And tomorrow, we do it again." The sun set over the western ridge, painting the sky in gold and violet. It was the same land, the same wind, the same vast, indifferent sky. But the people beneath it had changed. They had learned that the Wild West was not just a place of guns and gold. It was a place where love, if it was brave enough, could rewrite the rules of who gets to belong. And in the deepening twilight, the lights of the farmhouse burned steady and bright, a beacon for anyone trying to find their way home in the dark. Thank you for riding along on this journey through the dust and the heartache of the San Gabriel Valley. Stories like Jonah and Elena's remind us that even in the hardest times, courage and connection can reshape the world. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your city or country. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and romance, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the American frontier. And I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending. Did the price they paid feel real to you? Let me know in English in the comments. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your heart open.